Hey, it's Scott Petrak with another episode of the Brown Zone Coverage Podcast. For those new to the pod, I've covered the Browns for the Chronicle Telegram since 2004, and all my work can be found at brownzone.com. Once again, I'm joined by Dave Chudowsky of the WKYC Morning News. How are you, Dave? And are you ready to talk some Browns?
Well, I'm always ready to talk some Browns. I'm doing well. Hope you had a good holiday weekend, Scott. And good to be back in Berea for you, right?
Yeah, it was nice. I was out of town for the one rookie minicamp practice they had. So this is the first time I'd been in Berea and watched some form of practice. I'm doing some air quotes around practice. Since I want to say the Friday before the Chiefs playoff game. I think we were out there, but there might have been weather factor. There might have been a COVID factor. The practice schedule was so kind of wonky at the end of the season, but it would have been one of those final weeks in either the regular season or the playoffs that we got to watch a practice out in Berea. And I'm thinking it was before that Chiefs game. So that's a long time for me to go without seeing a football practice. So it was good, good to see friends in the media, good to see some of the guys running around on the field, Kevin Stefanski doing some coaching. So, I think it's a sign, it's kind of weird. I'm fighting we're heavily into the offseason. And, this is kind of a down period, again, with the air quotes, but it's also a signal of training camp's coming, and it's about 7 weeks away. And I think I'm going to have to get ready for some football because I know how high the anticipation level is going to be once we get to the end of July if we aren't already there in, June 3rd.
Can you give the listeners kind of a feeling of what it's going to be like? And I know that listeners and Browns fans aren't there at practice every day. They will be allowed to come to training camp again, which is a good thing. But do you feel like it's going to get back to normal? Do you feel like we're going to have a packed First Energy Stadium? And we're allowed to have capacity now, right? But
Right.
Did you get a sense yesterday that things are heading back to normal, or is it still kind of in limbo?
Yeah, that's a good question, Chud. I think I feel pretty confident about the stadium being 100%. Right, if the Indians are allowed to have 100% capacity at Progressive Field, I can't imagine the Browns not having 100%. And I know that's what the NFL expects and is planning for, unless something goes haywire with the pandemic. As far as training camp, the Browns have not released anything regarding that yet. I know the league had a meeting, I think it was a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, where the plan is to have fans at training camp. But you've been out there. There's not a lot of room separating the practice field from where the fans are. And I'm just not sure how that works logistically with the team trying to have whatever the number is. Is it the 2,000 they normally have? Is it 1,000? Is it 500? Like, where do you put the fans? Do you assume all your players have been vaccinated so it's not a big deal if they're somewhat close to fans who aren't vaccinated? Are there autograph signings, which is a huge part of a normal training camp, right? Players, usually a position group goes and signs autographs for, I don't know, it feels like a half an hour, sometimes after practice. So I think that is still to be worked out. I can tell you the media, whether you're vaccinated or not, were required to wear masks at practice yesterday, and we came nowhere near the players. So I think there's still stuff to work out there. I know the hope is to have, fans at training camp in Berea. I'm sure the union, the NFL Players Association, will have something to say about it. Are they comfortable with it? One of the other reporters, I think it was Zach Jackson of The Athletic, just said, why don't they move 5 practices to the stadium? Then you can space out. Nobody's close to the players. You probably dodge some iffy situations or some things that could give the Browns organization some headaches by doing that. But it feels like the plan is to do it in Berea, but I don't think we're there yet.
So correct me if I'm wrong. I think I saw 55 out of 90 players were there yesterday. And this is a 3-day thing this week?
Yeah, it's 3 days of OTAs this week, 4 days next week, and then the 3-day mandatory minicamp, June 15th through 17th. And yeah, we counted, we always take attendance. And we counted 55 of the 90 players on the roster there. 5 of them weren't really practicing due to a variety of injuries. Grant Delpit coming off the ruptured Achilles, JoJo Natson coming off the torn ACL. Rookie Anthony Schwartz had a sleeve on his leg. Rookie linebacker Tony Fields II was in a walking boot. And then D-tackle Malik McDowell, the guy with the troubled history, was a former second-round pick who they signed. Yeah, who they signed after the draft. He was watching. It was tough for me to tell what the injury was. But a specimen, when you look at him, he definitely has the body that the body type you're looking for. So at 55, which, is way higher than I would have anticipated a couple of weeks ago or maybe a month ago after J.C. Tretter and the Browns released a statement saying they weren't going to go to in-person voluntary workouts at the team facility. Most of the players were on defense. All of the big-name players were on defense. No Baker Mayfield, no Odell Beckham Jr., no starters on offense unless you count fullback Andy Janovich. And that makes some sense. I'm sure we'll get into it a little bit more, but the defense has gone through such an overhaul in this offseason. And they could have 9 new starters week 1 from a year ago that I just think there's a feeling among some of the defensive players that, hey, let's get together. Let's do it in Berea. Maybe some of the offensive guys work out together on their own. We've seen Baker throw with guys in Florida. We saw him do it in Austin a year ago. And I think it's just easier perhaps for the defense to come to Berea. Myles Garrett seemed to lead that charge. Now, not everybody was there. Jadeveon Clowney wasn't there. Takaris McKinley was not there. But there were enough guys and enough new guys that seemed a good reason for Myles and some of the other guys to show up, is to try to get some continuity because there's so many new faces.
Yeah, a lot to dive in there with the defense. Before we do that, though, I just kind of want to put this issue to bed. And I don't want to talk a lot about it because we've spent a lot of time on it over the last few weeks. But what you just said is exactly what I was thinking. Like, I was kind of surprised there was that many guys there because I felt like it was going to be barely any guys at all. But that's a pretty decent number considering what we were kind of led to believe. And again, a lot of questions. I went through the transcript. I didn't listen to it. And I wasn't there, but I read the entire thing. And it seemed like there were a lot more questions pelted at Stefanski about the voluntary situation and if they're getting the amount of work done they need to get done. Can we just kind of put that to bed here? And, is it an issue or not?
Yeah, for sure. And I felt like that was the opportunity to ask those questions yesterday. Now, next time we talk to J.C. Tretter, I'm sure it will come up again. And even when we talk to Baker, right? Why did you skip OTAs, assuming he doesn't show up next week? But this is the first time we've talked to many of these players. It's the first time we talked to Kevin Stefanski since they've been back on the field. So it seemed like the right time. I thought Stefanski handled it well. He stressed that it is voluntary. And whether he was asked if it was voluntary or really on his own, he just continued to bring it up, meaning there's not going to be a penalty for guys that don't show up. And he understands the dynamic is, I use the word tricky when I asked him about it. Complicated could work regarding J.C. Tretter, NFLPA president. He's been so outspoken. And Kevin Stefanski said, hey, I understand the dynamic. There's no, we're not holding against JC. There's nothing tricky about it. We get it. Now, he did say it's valuable for guys to be there. And the coaches like having the players there. And he thinks that yesterday was a good day of work, and they're doing a lot of teaching on the field. They're also still continuing to hold meetings virtually, which means Baker Mayfield and J.C. Tretter and the rest of the offensive guys who weren't there, and Jadeveon Clowney, can log on and participate in the meetings. And he said attendance in the virtual meetings has been very good. And I think that's an important thing to remember, that it's not like these guys are away from their coaches 100% because they're on these meetings and they're going through the installation. So, and then I asked Anthony Walker and Myles Garrett about it. And they said the dynamic within the players is good. And they understand that each player has their own choice to make. And J.C. Tretter's good with Myles Garrett showing up to camp and showing up to OTAs this week. And Myles even said, hey, it's not like we've been here the whole time. So it feels like there's a little bit of a compromise reached. They probably talked to, Kevin Stefanski said he talked to a bunch of the players multiple times about the offseason program and the schedule. So I feel like the dialogue's been good. And again, and he reiterated we want players to know when they come here, it's a safe place for them to work. And that's a big issue with JC, right? He doesn't want guys, he's trying to protect the health and safety of his players. So I feel like it's kind of a non-issue, that the players and the team are in a good space, but yet it is newsworthy because some of your biggest names aren't in Berea, and probably, we don't know how the OTAs will look next week, but probably won't be in Berea until the 3-day mini camp the following week.
But, and Scott, the thing about it is, and I've agreed with you throughout these podcasts when you've talked about how, and we both mentioned it, that last year they were just fine by going virtual. But then I started thinking about it over the last few weeks, but everyone was on the same playing field, right? Everyone was virtual.
Right.
And now, you see the stories about the Chiefs, and I bring them up because the Browns played them first. And then I think I was seeing that, Roethlisberger was talking about Najee Harris, right? The draft pick, the running back, and how hard of a worker he is. And they're around each other. And I started thinking, I'm like, is it going to be a disadvantage that they're not all together? And again, maybe I'm wrong and I'm grasping at straws here, but it just has to be brought up.
Sure. And I think if you take a step back, a handful of practices in May and June probably won't have much of an impact on September 12th when the Browns go to Kansas City. I also believe that every time you're on the field is probably helpful. Anytime the coaches can get their, hands on you is helpful. But there's a fight to be had here. And J.C. Tretter is at the front of that fight saying this is not a good thing for players, at least the way the voluntary program had been set up for years, with intense practices and too much contact in JC's eyes, at least. So, I was talking with one of the reporters, I think it was Nate Ulrich from the Beacon yesterday, about, is the fact that 55 players are there, and you look at Kansas City and they have near full participation. You look at Pittsburgh and Ben Roethlisberger's there, like you mentioned. Is that a win for the owners? Like, hey, the players tried to come together, tried to be unified, and yet there's still a bunch of guys there. And my first reaction is, yeah, that's a win for the owners, and we're always going to have this kind of form of voluntary offseason program. But Nate made a good point and said, yeah, but there's been concessions, and we're not seeing the same type of practices. We're seeing some teams shorten the offseason program and say, hey, come in, we'll meet for 6 or 7 days, and then you don't have to go to mandatory minicamp. So maybe those are the concessions that JC was looking for, and that it got through to the coaches that we can't have the same type of off-season program, and it will be safer for players and less injury risk. So maybe this prompted the changes, or at least some of the changes that JC was looking for. And my final point on the topic is, I think there's a sense of loyalty that some of his teammates have toward JC, and we're seeing that from, I think, the offensive guys. I think if JC weren't, and this is just me, putting 2 and 2 together. I think if JC weren't the NFLPA president and weren't so vocal about this issue, Baker Mayfield and Joe Bitonio would probably be in Berea. But they're showing loyalty to JC. And, when you talk about camaraderie and teamwork and all those kinds of things, I don't think that can be looked at as a bad thing either.
All right, let's talk about what you saw. And I know it's hard to really, break it down at a practice like this, but anything that kind of stands out to you with the defense, because as you mentioned, those are the defenses where the big name players were, and it was important having the veterans there for the rookies.
Right. Yeah, these are kind of the 5 things that, you looked around the field and I said, okay, I got to jot these down. And one was Greedy Williams, right? The corner that missed all of last year with the shoulder injury. Now, they're not hitting, they're not tackling, but he was on the field. He went through practice, and that's a great sign for a guy that, left the field, I want to say August 24th a year ago, and then wasn't heard from again. So that's a good sign. 6th-round rookie, I'm going to call him a running back, Demetric Felton, because that's what Andrew Berry, I think it was Andrew Berry, right after the draft said, we're going to call him a running back.
Or wide receiver.
Right, which he played both at UCLA. And I got a story. I got to write a story one of these days. I talked to his running back coach at UCLA, Deshaun Foster, who was in the league for a while, about Felton. And he played both. He played receiver, and then they switched into running back. But the first time I noticed him yesterday is when they break up from stretching and go to individual drills, and he goes to the receiver drills. So, they're cross training him, receiver and running back. Kevin Stefanski said he's been in both meeting rooms. He's smart enough to handle it. They love the versatility. Had a couple of drops in individuals, and then in team drills made one real nice catch and then followed it up with another catch. So that's always a good sign. You can't read too much into anything, but to bounce back within a practice, I think coaches would appreciate that. Andrew Billings, right? The D tackle that the Browns signed to a 1-year, $3.5 million contract in March of 2020. And then he opted out because of COVID, has asthma. So he was worried about that, worried about his family. He's back and he's huge. And I've watched him play against the Browns because he played with the Bengals for 3 years. And never really stood out. Was kind of a rotational player, although he started, I want to say 30 games over the last 2 years with the Bengals. I don't remember him being that big. Now, I don't know if the Browns are asking him to lose weight. I don't know if that's just his body type, but it really jumps out at you. It kind of reminded me of, I'm flashing back here, but Jerry Ball when he was right when he was
that
old.
Big?
Yeah, I mean I think they list him at 324, something like that. He looks bigger than that. And why it stands out even more is because that's such a different body type than really the rest of the D tackles they have. Malik Jackson is a tall, kind of skinny D tackle. I want to say 6'5", might be 6'7". I should have my roster in front of me. Malik McDowell, who I mentioned, is more of a slender, taller, athletic-looking D tackle. Jordan Elliott is a little heavier than that, but nowhere near Billings. Tommy Togiai is a little squattier, but not doesn't look fat at all. And then you have Billings, and it's interesting to see, okay, is he the one guy that they're going to use as kind of that nose tackle, run stuffing guy, play on early downs, and then take him off the field? Because he doesn't seem like at that size he's much of a pass rusher. So it'll be interesting. It's interesting to see, does he still fit in what the Browns are looking for? Has their philosophy changed enough since a year ago when they signed him that maybe he is on the bubble heading into training camp? Because, I still think of him as a starter, right? When you go, okay, what's your base defense, your 4-3? I would think it would be him and Malik Jackson. But that could change, especially because Andrew Berry signed Malik McDowell and he drafted Tommy Togiai and he signed undrafted rookie Marvin Wilson. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out with Billings. I mentioned McDowell looks the part. All we got to do is see him stand there, but looks the part. And then finally, James Hudson, the offensive tackle from the University of Cincinnati, is an imposing figure. And the Browns lined him up at right tackle and left tackle during team drills yesterday. And, I know that they're hoping that he can be one of their backup linemen, right? And you only keep 3, maybe 4 on the roster. Sometimes you only dress 2 extra linemen on game day. And, it might be asking a lot for a 4th-round rookie who started his college career at Michigan at defensive lineman to say, okay, you're going to be our number 6 or our number 7, depending on how Chris Hubbard comes back from his knee injury that he suffered in December a year ago. But he certainly, again, looks the part, has a lot of physical. He looks strong, and he's the kind of guy that gets out in space and can run and block and pull in this wide zone scheme. So those are the 5 things that kind of jumped out at me the most.
Going back to those weights, I just saw Andrew Billings. They have him at 328.
28, okay.
And Malik Jackson at 285.
Right. And that's a big deal, a big difference. And Billings there's no way. Obviously, if you just look at him from 40 yards away, which I was, and I've seen some pictures since yesterday, I would take the over on 328. Now, that doesn't mean he can't play, right? That doesn't mean he can't play. It's just, to me, the most significant part is that it's a contrast in body type, right? And it's almost like linebacker, where you have Sione Takitaki, who's kind of a run defender and kind of a bruiser, who played. I thought he made a lot of improvement a year ago, but he's not Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, and he's not Tony Fields II. And is there space for a guy like that on this roster, right? When you're limited to 53 guys, do you say, okay, our base defense is Billings and Taki, but you might only play 10 snaps a game against some teams. Now, maybe the Ravens, who run the ball a bunch, you might play 40 snaps, right? I just think it's interesting when you talk roster construction, how Andrew Berry will view those type of guys and how important they are versus more disruptive players up front, like a Malik McDowell, or like a Marvin Harrison, like a Malik Jackson. And then in linebacker, the physical, I can stack and shed blockers versus the Owusu Koromoas, who you perceive as, not perceive as, he was drafted to play in space and cover and blitz. And those are just two different skill sets. And I'm interested to see how the Browns view that and how coordinator Joe Woods tries to blend those types of players.
All right, I want to follow up on 3 of the points you made. You don't have to go long on any one of them, maybe just a quick thought to follow up. First one is when you talk about Billings, a lot of people would say they're concerned about the Browns at defensive tackle, right?
Yeah.
Do you think maybe in Andrew Berry's mind and Stefanski's mind, they're like, well, don't forget about Billings because he didn't play last year. And, this is a guy that we're counting on big time.
I do. I think that when we saw Larry Ogunjobi leave in free agency and be allowed to leave in free agency, and Sheldon Richardson get cut to save salary cap space, I have no doubt that Andrew Berry said, hey, we signed Andrew Billings a year ago to be part of our rotation and a key part of their rotation and probably a top 3 member of the rotation. And just because he sat out a year, I don't think that changes. He's still young. He's in the prime of his career. So, yeah, I do think the Browns are counting on him. Now, he was away for a whole year, so they have to see it show up, and I think it's good for him to be in Berea for the OTAs and for this offseason. So, yeah, I think they're counting on him, but I also think that there's been a lot of movement at that position recently, and it will be interesting to see how all that plays out. Because let's say they keep 5. Well, if it's Billings and Malik Jackson and Tommy Togiai, right? Those guys seem like 3 automatics. Well, I'm forgetting Jordan Elliott, the 3rd-round pick a year ago. That seems like 4 automatics. So then in the 5th spot, if there is a 5th spot, is between Malik McDowell, Marvin Wilson, who the Browns considered a steal that they could sign after the draft and gave him a bunch of guaranteed money, reportedly. So how does that work, right? And then when there's other guys on the roster. Damian Square, who's been in the league a long time, is on the roster. They have another veteran. They have other veteran guys. Now, Malik Jackson can slide out to end. Maybe Malik McDowell can slide out to end. And that buys you another spot. And maybe you keep 9 guys. But even then, I don't think the Browns keep more than 9 defensive linemen. So I think it's going to be quite a battle, and I think it's going to be D tackle. We're going to spend a lot of time watching at training camp, and linebacker to see how they're constructed and who winds up winning these jobs.
Yeah, but I'll tell you though, this is the first year I can remember in a long time where you have a pretty decent idea about the roster compared to years past. I mean, there's definitely going to be questions, but I mean, and that just shows you how much better the roster is.
Oh, there's no doubt. And I just did, we went through it a little bit last week, a quick depth chart. Somebody had asked me for my mailbag, so I actually got around to it in my mailbag. I just posted it before we started recording this Thursday morning. And I went through, okay, these are my 53 guys that make the roster. Way too early to project, but here we go. And really, there's not a lot of tough decisions. You can slot, okay, where does Rashard Higgins fit in the receiver rotation, right? That's a question. But as far as who's going to make the team, there's only about a handful of spots. And it's D tackle, it's linebacker, it's maybe who's a 6th corner, who's your 5th safety. I mean, things that I think your average fan might not even notice, right? And guys that won't play unless there's injuries. I think those are the battles we're going to be talking about, where in the old days, which aren't too old, It was, who's going to be your starting quarterback? Do they have two receivers that they can line up? And the Browns no longer have those kinds of serious questions.
Boy, just imagine the second thing I wanted to hit was Felton at wide receiver, or, whatever you want to call him. But man, you start thinking about the weapons they have, Scott. And if this guy pans out and they can add him, because, you don't want to forget about Kareem Hunt. I know he's a running back, but, obviously we see what he does in the receiving game. I think Harrison Bryant's going to be a stud as the years go on here. And then obviously, at least for this year, you have Landry and Beckham together. It's pretty dangerous.
Well, it really is. And I think one of the reasons the Browns kind of slotted Felton at running back is there's not a lot of room. There's no room at receiver. If you go Beckham, Landry, Higgins, Hodge, Peoples-Jones, and Anthony Schwartz, the third-round burner out of Auburn, that's 6. And they're probably not keeping 7. So I think Felton, if he's going to stick, he sticks as that third running back, behind Chubb and Hunt with Janovich as your fullback. So, yeah, they're deep. They're deep in all these spots. How do they work in Felton? Do they work him into the slot at all? Anthony Schwartz, how do they get him on the field in that mix? Because, Beckham and Landry will play a lot. How does he fit in? How do you put him on the field? And then you're taking reps away from Higgins or Hodge. And he's not as big, so he's probably not the same type of blocker, but you love his speed. And those are the intricacies that I think Kevin Stefanski and coordinator Alex Van Pelt are working through, and will be the things we notice, the differences we noticed from a year ago is how they handle, is how they're able to expand the offense in those ways. How much can you use Chubb and Hunt together? How do you use Schwartz and Felton and Harrison Bryant, all those guys you mentioned? I think that's how the offense is going to evolve, but it's not going to be easy because there's a lot of players for only 5 skill guys to be on the field for every snap.
Will Durinis Johnson be out, do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. Maybe. Probably. In my roster, I had him out. Now, he's bigger than Felton, right? And Felton will have to show that he can pick up the blitz because that's key for a backup running back, and Durinis Johnson has shown the willingness to do that. Now, maybe you keep a guy that's just a returner and you figure out a way to carry that guy in your roster, and that turns out to be a Felton or a Schwartz, so you can keep a 4th running back or maybe even keep a 7th receiver. But it's hard to keep those extra guys at receiver running back when Stefanski runs so many multiple tight end sets, right? Like I try to go, okay, well, maybe they only keep 3 tight ends, Hooper, Njoku, and Bryant. But if one of those guys gets hurt, all of a sudden you can't run the 3 tight ends that they run a lot. So I leaned toward a 4th tight end in 1 less running back. But I think there's some gray area there. Stefanski, when he came, said, hey, I need a fullback. He was adamant. But Andy Janovich did not play a ton last year. Do they go away from fullback? Do they go to a roster that doesn't have one? That seems like a leap from only a year ago where Stefanski was so adamant about having a fullback. But maybe you play to your strengths, and your strengths are, tight end, receiver, running back. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, that is an excellent point there. Last thing from the points you made from your 5 keys, is the battle between Greedy Williams and Greg Newsome II, is that the biggest battle to watch in training camp, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, Chud, because there's so many dynamics there, right? You got your 1st-round draft pick. You got a guy that was a 2nd-round draft pick only a couple of years ago, but wasn't on the field, and we have questions about his shoulder, right? That's a serious nerve injury that took a long time to even start to heal. Is he going to be able to stay healthy? If he does, then all of a sudden you have a really deep cornerback room. So, yeah, I think that will be a really good battle, assuming Greedy's healthy. And, yeah, I would say that's one of the few spots where a starting job is open. And then you say, okay, the loser of that battle, he might not play much because Troy Hill is penciled in to be that nickel. And I don't think Greedy is built to be a nickel. Now, maybe he can, maybe they'll put him there and say, hey, you got to have that versatility. I saw Newsome take at least a couple of reps inside yesterday in the slot, which I thought was interesting because, I view him as an outside corner. So, yeah, I think that's going to be a really good battle. Just as in that limited practice yesterday, you could see Newsome's athleticism, right, which is one of the reasons the Browns drafted him at 26. I would pencil him in ahead of Greedy just because, the Browns went and took him in the first round. But I do think that'll be certainly one of the biggest battles, if not the biggest battle.
All right. Probably the biggest story this week was when Myles Garrett put out on social media that he was heading to Cleveland. He was there. He's here, I should say.
Yeah.
I said there, meaning the one day you got to see him. How do he look to you? And he talked with the media. What stood out?
Yeah, Myles is Myles. And I felt this since the first day he arrived after they drafted him number 1 out of A&M. He just looks different than most guys on a football field. And we're talking an NFL field, right? He stands out. He jumps out. He's the first guy off the bus kind of thing because he's 6'4", or whatever. Is it 268? Is it 272? Wherever he is, he's just an imposing specimen. And he moves like crazy. Anthony Walker, the new linebacker that they signed, said, I've never seen a guy that big with his kind of flexibility, right? He said he's a huge human being and he's crazy flexible. So, I thought it was important that Myles came, not that he needed to be there. I thought it was newsworthy that Myles came. And he said, like we talked about, new faces on defense. It's a long time not to, hit the bags if you're some of these guys. I thought it was a good idea for a lot of the defensive guys to show up. So he led the way. I thought from talking to Myles, and it was a good interview, and he talked for a while, the two things that jumped out were, number one, Kevin Stefanski said Myles is retired as a pickup basketball player. And the way Stefanski said it, I wasn't 100% sure he was serious, but then he doubled down on it. And then Garrett got asked about it. And Garrett said, he said, I'm going to call it a Jordan retirement, a Michael Jordan retirement. He went and played baseball that 1 year, but then he came back to basketball. And he said, who knows what I'll do next season? Maybe I'll play basketball again. Maybe I'll play baseball. I read it as the Browns watched Myles do all these dunks and play all this basketball on Instagram and Twitter videos for the last couple of months and were scared out of their mind that their $125 million man is going to break an ankle or, tear a knee, whatever can happen on a basketball court. And that as soon as they got him back in Berea, they said, dude, you have to knock it off. And I don't know what his contract says, because if his contract says you can't play basketball, then I don't think the Browns would have let it go this long. But I really think that that's kind of how it went down is either, hey, if you do it in January or February and March, okay. But when we get closer to training camp, we can't afford a rolled ankle that costs you 6 weeks and hurts you as we get into the season and slows you down. So we have to cut it off. And that makes sense to me, and it seemed like Myles is open to that. I have a hard time imagining Myles not playing basketball next March. I just think he loves it too much, and he didn't buy into the retirement. It seemed like a temporary retirement to me. So I thought that was interesting, and I understand Stefanski's point is, yeah, it's cool that Myles can tomahawk dunk and windmill, but if he comes down funky or some dorky dude at the Y is laying under him and, Myles bends a knee, that's not good for anybody. So I think we've probably seen the last of Myles playing basketball for the next 6 months. Then the other thing that jumped out at me is Myles, we know Myles struggled with COVID last year, and he missed 2 games and then wasn't the same. And he said his oxygen level, I don't know if you call it his wind or conditioning, was like 50% when he came back. And that he was so kind of out of it physically that it was tough to remember like plays. Like he struggled to remember, okay, here's the play, and then couldn't think beyond that as far as, okay, what's my counter move? And how do I adjust to this if the lineman does that? Because he's just fighting from a conditioning standpoint. Now he says he's back to 100%, feels as well as he has since he got COVID, which is a great sign. And he's still frustrated and hurt that the COVID really affected his run at Defensive Player of the Year across the league. Wound up going to Aaron Donald for the third time. Now, Miles, he hurt his knee a little bit in the Raiders game before the bye. But after that game, I think he played about less than half the snaps that game. But then after the bye, came back, played a bunch. His production wasn't the same as it was in the first 6 or 7 weeks when he had 4 forced fumbles and just, I think he was October Player of the Year in October, I think. There was a little bit of the dip anyway, and then you had COVID, and there was a much bigger dip. And Miles is pointing to that as a big factor in him kind of dropping out of the race, which was really Aaron Donald and TJ Watt by the time we got to the end of the season. So Miles is focused on the team, and he tries to correct you when you ask him, say otherwise. But Super Bowl is his number one goal. But he really wants to win a Defensive Player of the Year. And he's said that since the moment he got drafted. It means a lot to him. He believes he should be in that discussion. He believes he's that type of a player and a talent. And he was off to that kind of start last year. And then for him, he thinks COVID was the biggest reason that he still wasn't in the final discussion, when we got to the end of the season.
All right, before we get to my last question for you, anything else you want to put out there about yesterday before we wrap it up here? Anthony Walker talked yesterday.
Yeah.
Stefanski, obviously, you talked a little bit about Walker throughout this thing. We just touched on Miles. Stefanski seemed pretty upbeat in his conversation. You seemed impressed by Walker, it sounds like. Yeah. Anything you want to throw out there to finish this off?
Yeah, the last thing – I'm going to try to write about Walker today. I'm going to the dentist to get a crown, so hopefully that doesn't waylay me for the whole day. But if it doesn't, thanks. If it doesn't, I'm going to write about Anthony Walker just because I didn't get to write about him much yesterday. A couple of points. He said he's known Greg Newsome for a while, both Northwestern guys like myself. And when he signed with the Browns, he said Newsome texted him congrats, and Walker said, "I can see you here." And then he texted him the morning of the draft and said Cleveland. And obviously the Browns wind up getting Newsome. So there's a connection there. It's a little bit of a big brother, little brother. And Walker, I think the line was, people are going to have a hard time catching the ball against Newsome. And it's a simple statement, but to say that about a rookie, I think it speaks volumes. And then Walker also talked about Owusu-Koramoah, right? Both in the linebacker room, will probably be on the field a lot together. And, he said you can see all the athleticism that you need. The explosiveness, the athleticism are elite. It's all about him getting comfortable with the playbook and the mental side and what it takes to play linebacker in this league. And he compared him to Darius Leonard, who he became like super close friends with the Colts. Leonard was, I think, Defensive Rookie of the Year a few years ago. So to use that comparison, part of the comparison was it took Leonard a while to grasp everything, right? It's just a slow process, and that's what Owusu-Koramoah is going through. But even to use that name means he feels like Owusu-Koramoah has that type of talent, and he's one of the favorites to be Defensive Rookie of the Year because I think people think he is that special and kind of that different of a player and that he will stand out on the field. And Anthony Walker agrees with that.
All right. Do you have time to get into these 100 players, the CBS ranking, or you want to hold that for next time?
We could talk about real quick. We can do real quick. You know what? No, Chubb, let's save it because there's a bunch of players that come into that discussion. When you're talking about who the top 100 guys in the league are, just to say the Browns had 5 guys make the top 100, and that seems like a good number, right? Because it's less than 3 a team if you divide it. Or actually, it's 3 a team, right? 96, so just over 3. So 5 seems like a solid number for a team with Super Bowl expectations. But I could go to 5 or 6 other guys off the top of your head that say, whoa, isn't he close to 100? So I think there's a lot to delve into there. And whether or not we get to it next week or we get into it in that kind of dead period between minicamp and training camp, I think it's a good discussion topic.
Yeah, let's hold off on that one. Now, Baker was not in that top 100, was he?
No, he was in the just missed.
Okay.
Category. Yeah.
So I want to next time we talk next week, I want to this is what we call a tease in the business, Scott, where
Okay.
We mention something but don't actually get to it. But I was talking with someone yesterday, and it really it got me thinking that if anything happened to Baker, what would happen to the Browns? And I kind of want to talk more about Case Keenum and if that were to arise. So that's kind of like a tease for next week if you think they'd be okay. And, we'll hit that 100 players at some point too. But I got to tell you, I'll end with this story. Good luck with that crown, man. I've had a couple crowns. And this short story here for you. Back in 2006, I had just met my wife a few months earlier, and I took her on a family trip to Florida. Now, that was brave on her part to go on that family trip, not knowing them that well and just meeting me a few months early, right?
Yeah.
But I had to have a root canal, and that's where you get the crown. And I had to have, they make the crown for you, right? So for about a week, and I don't know where you're at in this process, but I had a temporary crown and went to a party on a Saturday night in Cleveland. We were flying out Sunday morning. That Saturday night, my crown fell out and I swallowed it. So I had an open spot on my tooth and it killed for the whole week down in Florida.
John.
Painful, my man.
It's a good thing I don't have a lot of time to dwell on this because as soon as we hang up, I got to drive straight to the dentist. But yeah, I'm starting the process today. So I get the temporary today. So I'll be walking around with that for, I think it's 2 weeks before I get the new one. But I don't have any trips planned. So
yeah, don't go out of town. So
good advice.
Yeah. Ugh. All right.
Cool.
Good luck.
Thanks, buddy. Well, it was great talking to you, Chud. We'll do this again next week. We'll have another OTA session to talk about. We'll get into that. We'll get into Case Keenum. Maybe we'll get into the rankings. If not next week at some point, where we'll preview minicamp and all the guys that'll be back in Berea. Maybe the Jarvis Landry charity softball game is also at the end of next week. So plenty to talk about, things heating up before we take the break before training camp. So thanks for everybody for listening. This has been another episode of the Brown Zone Coverage Podcast. And thanks, Dave Chudowsky, for joining me. We'll talk to you next week.